My name is Frank Mitchkay. I'm the Deputy Director of the Next Social Contract Initiative here at New America. As we mentioned in our invite for the event, both of the presidential nominees have been talking about the inadequacy of policies and institutions that have traditionally been thought of as the foundation of our social contract, which were designed for a very different world of the mid-20th century. As one of our panelists, Michael Lind, has said, and I borrow this line all too frequently, the social contract is not just the safety net to catch individuals if they fall, although that is part of it, but it's also the metaphorical trapeze above the net, the apparatus that allows individuals to soar and to rise and occasionally to fall. So the social contract is about economic opportunity and economic security and finding the right balance between the two. And we're gratified to see that both nominees are speaking the language of the Next Social Contract Initiative, whether they know it or not. What's striking, though, is that neither has spoken in similar terms about adapting the tax code to the very different circumstances of the 21st century. Fortunately, we have a group of folks here today who have done that prolifically and effectively. And as Professor Gratz points out in his book, it looks like 2010 will be a once-in-a-generation opportunity to discuss major fundamental tax reform. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to encourage you to go to our website for the Next Social Contract Initiative. That's nextsocialcontract.org, and to read more about our program of events and publications, and also please to take a look at some of the documents from NSC that we have out at the table out front. And now on to our panel. To my furthest right, Michael Lind is the Whitehead Senior Fellow here at New America and the author of a number of books, including The Radical Center, which was a foundational document for New America, and The American Way of Strategy, U.S. Foreign Policy, and The American Way of Life. Later this year, he will be publishing as part of the Next Social Contract Initiative a monograph entitled The American Social Contract, A Promise to Fulfill. And we hope you'll be here for the event launching that. Next to Michael, Maya McGinnis is the director of the Fiscal Policy Program at New America and the president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. She has published extensively on tax reform and entitlement issues and previously served as Social Security advisor to Senator McCain's 2000 campaign. We're also pleased to have Howard Gleckman here today as our moderator. Howard is a senior research associate at the Urban Institute and editor of Urban's tax blog, TaxVox. He's done a good deal of work around long-term care, particularly recently. He's a visiting fellow at Boston College's Center for Retirement Research, and will be releasing a book in the somewhat near future on the issue of long-term care. And now, the centerpiece of our discussion today, Professor Michael J. Gratz. Michael's been a professor at Yale Law School for the last 25 years, the last 22 as the Justice Hotchkiss Professor of Law. Prior to that, he was on the faculty at the University of Virginia, University of Southern California, and the California Institute of Technology. He is a tireless advocate for tax reform and simplification and for a sensible approach to the very difficult fiscal realities the federal government faces. As such, he has testified numerous times before Congress on a range of issues. Most recently, he has been front and center on debates on the alternative minimum tax and wholesale tax reform. He's also the author of Federal Income Taxation Principles and Policies, a popular law school course book, among several other books on the tax system and federal policy. He served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary and Special Counsel to the Secretary in the Treasury Department under President George H.W. Bush, and previously in the Office of the Tax Legislative Counsel under President Nixon. He's a Fellow of the Academy of Arts and Sciences, a graduate of Emory University and the University of Virginia Law School. Please welcome Professor Michael Gratz.
Thank you. Thanks to the New America Foundation for having this event, and to Howard and Michael and Maya for being here to comment, and to you for coming to listen. This is the book, you can find on Amazon. This is my favorite slide. This is the complexity and number of words in the Internal Revenue Code and regulations. I just like to use this slide wherever I go. The Internal Revenue Code itself is now 6 times longer than War and Peace and not nearly as readable. This is just federal receipts and outlays over time. What you see is that we have had surpluses very rarely. We had one in 1969. We had some in the late 1990s, and none in between. Alan Greenspan famously in January of 2001 told the Senate Finance Committee, told the Senate Banking Committee, sorry, that if we did not have do something, this looming surpluses were so large that the federal government would not only pay off all of its debt, but would also have to own corporate securities, a scenario that Greenspan greatly feared. So the good news is that that problem has now been solved. The federal debt is over $9 trillion, rapidly moving toward $10 trillion. The problem of government ownership of corporate stock, however, has not been solved. Today it is the sovereign wealth funds of the selling Middle East who are owning our corporate stock. So I don't know how Alan Greenspan feels about that. But it's clear that the combination, I'll show you a slide on trade deficits shortly, the combination of fiscal deficits and trade deficits are a huge problem for the United States. And as Ben Friedman put it so well, this is a problem that accumulates over time and is very troubling. One of the things to be said is that neither presidential candidate gives you great confidence in their willingness to deal with the problem over the short term. John McCain has a plan which the Urban Institute and Howard's colleagues have estimated to lose several $trillion going forward, and Barack Obama's plan is not much better. Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, in response to a question by George Stephanopoulos in the Philadelphia debate, both took the pledge of no new taxes on what they described as America's middle class, which they clarified as people earning under $250,000. That's the 90% of Americans who are in the middle class. I always describe it as the voting middle class. But that's the kind of pledge that will come back to haunt the next president in the same way that a similar and more famous pledge came to haunt George H.W. Bush. This is where we get our money. I'm going to skip some slides because I want to give the commentators time. This is where we get our money. One of the things that's very interesting is that for a very long time, the individual income tax has raised about half of our revenues, not quite half, but about half of our revenues, no matter what the rates and no matter what the base. We just seem to get about half our revenues from the individual income tax since the Second World War. The payroll tax has grown dramatically. Excise taxes have dropped dramatically. And we rely less heavily today on the corporate income tax than we once did as a source of revenues. But I would argue there's good reason for that these days. These are just top U.S. marginal income tax rates. It's just interesting to look at it. In the 50s and early 60s, the top rate was 91%. When Ronald Reagan took office, the top rate was 70%. When he left office, the top rate was 28%. It went up to 39.6 during the Clinton administration. It's actually a little over 40 because of some secret rate increases. And then down to 35 in the current administration, and it is promised, at least if Barack Obama is elected, to go back up toward 40% going forward. Corporate rates have gone down, but not nearly so much. They were always lower than the individual rates. Today they're about the same as the top individual rate. We have a 35% corporate rate. And if you compare the U.S. And trading partners, what you see is that we are now the second highest country in the OECD on corporate rates. Our individual rates are pretty much in line. These are combined federal and state rates. The others were just federal rates. Are pretty much in line, but you'll see that our threshold for the top rate is much higher than that of other countries. One of the main points I want to leave you with is the role of the U.S. in the international economy. And this has changed dramatically over time, as I'll get to in a moment. This is just a chart on what's happened to statutory corporate tax rates. After the '86 Act, the U.S. was the lowest in the OECD, but as you'll see, in recent years, the rest of this is EU average, EU 15, the old EU numbers, and the EU numbers are dropping down to 29.5. The OECD average is about 28 or 29, and they're all moving downward. We've stayed constant during that period, which is why we're now second highest in the OECD. Here's another piece of the story that's very important. Everyone else in the world, by which I mean 146 countries, there'll be a prize for anyone who can list 146 countries at the end of this session. I dare you to do it. They all have, you can do it, Howard. You can do it?
No. I just write down the ones that don't.
Huh?
I'll write down the ones.
Write down the ones that don't. No, you have to list the 146 that do. Have value-added taxes, which is the form of a consumption tax that we see everywhere else in the world. The United States is unique in having no value-added tax in its system. What this means for the U.S. is that we're a low-tax country. If you look at our taxes as a percentage of our domestic product, you'll see that we're very low compared to the OECD or compared to Europe. We're a low-tax country overall, but we're not a low-income tax country. We're consistent with the rest of the world in terms of our income taxes. We're not taking advantage of our position as a low-tax country because we have no tax on consumption. And the value-added tax is the tax. Here's a map. I understand that the Gulf region is going to turn red soon. The blue countries are the ones that now Greenland up there, which looks much larger than it is in economic terms, is supposed to be blue, and the United States is supposed to be blue. And the next largest country, of course, is Alaska, which was really part of the U.S. But what you see there is that only a very few countries in the world no longer don't have value-added taxes. A handful of countries, mostly in Africa, is where the value-added tax does not exist. You know, if I can only show one slide, this is the slide that I want to show. This shows you how out of touch we are with what's going on in the rest of the world in terms of tax policy. This is a better slide for the point that was made on the previous slide. This is the long-term fiscal picture. So I mentioned the short-term picture, which is not pretty. The long-term picture is actually very ugly. The long-term picture, this is actual revenues up until the vertical line, and then the projected revenues are just the average over history. It's 18.6% of GDP. This shows projections of the CBO or GAO. They're all the same for spending. And what you see is that revenues are not enough to pay for Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security, let alone defense, interest on the federal debt, or anything else as you go forward into the 21st century. Now, obviously, this brings up Herb Stein's maxim that if something can't happen, it won't. I'm paraphrasing. But this obviously can't happen. Either revenues have to go down or spending has to come down, probably some combination of both. It's crucial, part of this has to do with an aging population, but it's also crucial that health care costs get under control, by which I mean that they only rise at the level that everything else is rising in the economy. Much of this increase in Medicare and Medicaid is due to rising health care costs. But one thing you should remember is that when people talk about getting health care costs under control, one person's cost is another person's income. And so it also, I mean, the health part of the economy is producing good jobs and relatively high-paying jobs, and so we're going to get the income under control as well, and so that's going to be a problem both politically and conceptually. This is an interesting chart. This is about progressivity. There's a lot of talk about progressivity. What you see is that the income tax is, about where it was. The most interesting part of this chart to me is that the first two quintiles no longer pay income tax anymore. You can see it better on this chart. This is 2006. Both the first quintile and the second quintile, that's the bottom 40% of the population, pay no income taxes. In fact, their taxes are negative. This has to do with the earned income tax credit and child credits and the like. The third quintile pays very little as a percentage of federal income tax. The top quintile pays over 80% of the income tax today. Top 10% pays 2/3 of the income tax today, so that the income tax itself is a very progressive tax and will continue to be progressive over time.
This doesn't include the payroll tax.
This does not include the payroll tax. This is just the income tax. This is who pays the income tax. You know, and part of the story here is that the income has become more concentrated near the top, so there's more income at the top, is another reason that there are more taxes being paid by the top. This gives you the Social Security tax and the income tax, and you'll see that for 4/5 of the population, the Social Security tax is the Social Security payroll taxes, which include not only the Social Security tax but also the Medicare tax, Part A of Medicare, 15.3% total, is the highest tax paid in those bottom 4 quintiles. But what's interesting about the payroll tax, two things are interesting. One is people don't complain about it. It's easy to administer, and while it clearly there needs to be something done at the top, because we no longer are taxing as much wages as we used to tax under the Social Security tax, because wages have become more highly concentrated with people who are above the income cutoff for Social Security. The wage cutoff for Social Security is now about $100,000. You know, you need to do something about restoring some of those wages to the base in order to solve the problems of Social Security and improve the problems of financing health care costs, I think. But the payroll tax, you know, Roosevelt, I want to say one thing about the payroll tax. Roosevelt, I think following it, well, and John Kenneth Galbraith both make the same point, which is that you can have a very progressive system if you have a flat tax or even a regressive tax, as we now have in the Social Security system, if you're using it to finance very progressive benefits. And this, I think, has implications for our current health care situation, which we'll probably talk about as we go on. But I want to get to the plan without taking too much time. This is just net worth. Wealth is distributed much more unevenly in the United States than even income, which is uneven enough these days, more than enough. This is just internationalization of the economy. I'm going to go through these slides rather quickly. The point here, though, is just to look at how much growth. This is exports and imports. This shows you the trade imbalance on imports versus exports. But notice how recently these have grown as much as they have. Capital flows have grown even more dramatically very recently. And if you go back to 1986, which is not shown, but 85 is shown, you'll see that we're many times greater in terms of capital flows both into and outside of the United States than we were the last time we did major tax reform in the 1980s. And let me just say this. There was a time, it was true I think even as recently as 1986, but certainly when the international rules came into effect for the United States, the United States could do whatever it wanted to do. It didn't have to pay any attention to what was going on in the rest of the world. We were the world's greatest capital exporter. We were dominant in the world economy. U.S. headquartered firms were dominant in the world economy. And this is no longer true. We're now the world's greatest importer of capital. We used to think of developing countries as being only importers of capital, but if you look at recent data, I don't have a slide with me on this, but if you look at recent data, what's striking about the new economy is that the great capital exporters today, the people who are exporting capital, are developing countries, as we would call them. These include the petro countries, where the oil revenues have been so high that they're now recirculating that capital throughout the industrial world, and also the BRIC countries, China, Russia, India, and Brazil. And so we can no longer think of any country as simply a capital importer or a capital exporter. We have to think of each country as doing both. Capital flows are going in both directions, and our tax system really has to take this into account. And this is not the place, by that I mean the U.S. tax system, is not the place for American exceptionalism. And I came to the plan that I'm about to describe basically by rejecting lots of other ideas. But let me just say a word about consumption taxes. There have been a number of proposals for consumption taxes, the most recent of which is in the President's Panel report, which came out a year and a half ago. These are unique forms of consumption taxes. There's a progressive consumption tax that Maya has advocated that was introduced by Sam Nunn and Pete Domenici in the mid-90s. And this is a tax that's used nowhere else in the world. It was used briefly. It was invented by Nick Calder, who was a British economist. It was briefly, because of the British influence, put into place in India and Sri Lanka. It was repealed shortly afterwards because it didn't work there. And the supporters of the Nunn-Domenici plan don't believe it'll work here. They've all given up on it, as far as I can tell. There was the flat tax, which Dick Armey and Steve Forbes and others have argued for, which was invented by Bob Hall and Al Rabushka at Stanford, which is a form. I'm going to say these words, and you can come back if you want me to put flesh into them. But it's a form of a subtraction method value-added tax, but wages are collected at the end of tax on wages collected at the individual level instead of at the business level, as under a normal value-added tax. What this means is that all of these consumption taxes are dramatically inconsistent with international practice, and in particular, under the GATT and under the World Trade Organization agreements, you cannot impose this tax on consumption in the United States. It has to be imposed on an origin basis rather than a destination basis. Most consumption taxes are imposed on a destination basis. That is, you tax it where the consumption occurs. What this means is that a U.S. manufacturer will be subject to these taxes on the full value added of their products, but an importer will only be taxed on the markup in the U.S. So you imagine how an auto dealer who's selling Fords is going to feel when he's competing with an auto dealer selling imported cars where the tax is borne fully in the U.S. on the Fords and not on the imports. Economists will tell you this doesn't matter. Exchange rates will take care of this. This assumes freely floating exchange rates, and as we know, at least China has not allowed its exchange rate to float quite so freely. More importantly, the President's Commission decided that you had to have border adjustments. That is, you had to tax imports and exempt exports in order for compliance reasons, in order to make the tax work. And they noted that their proposal, which they called a growth and investment tax because it was a hybrid consumption income tax, they noted that their proposal would require the renegotiation of the GATT WTO agreement and all 86 of the U.S. income tax treaties. Now, you know, I've been around this tax business a long time. It will be hard enough to get Congress and a president to agree on something. But if we've got to get all of our tax treaties and all of our trade treaties renegotiated along the way, this is just a non-starter in my view. The value-added tax is consistent with international principles. You can tax imports and exempt exports, which is what we should be doing. This is more about globalization. Let me get to the proposal just so I don't take up too much time. So here's the proposal. There are 4 pieces that I describe as essential. There are other pieces described in the book. The first is to enact a value-added tax. It takes a 10 to 14% rate to do what I want to do with it. The rate depends on the base. You tell me whether food is in the base, and I'll tell you what the rate has to be, but I don't know the answer to that. But it takes a 10 to 14% rate. One thing I want to do is exempt the first $100,000 of family income, so everybody gets an exemption of up to $100,000, $50,000 for single people, and lower the income tax rate to 20 or 25%. I say here 25%. I would lower the corporate income tax to 15%. I say 15 to 20 in the book. I really would push for the lower corporate rate. This would apply to U.S. Income earned by both domestic and multinational businesses. This would make the U.S. Probably the most competitive economy in the world in these terms. and I would replace the earned income tax credit and provide an offset for what would otherwise be the regressivity of the value-added tax through a combination of payroll tax adjustments and something which I call here smart cards, but I learned a few weeks ago in Washington that I don't mean smart cards, I mean debit cards, but they're like bank cards. Smart cards, people tell me, have too much information. They're too smart for what I want them to do. So I just mean debit cards here. This would basically put along with state sales taxes, put our consumption taxes in line with the EU and the OECD. This is fairly old data. This is 2000 numbers. I haven't updated it. The consumption taxes elsewhere have gone up a good bit since this came and since this chart was put together. It needs to be updated. We basically be in line with the rest of the world in terms of our consumption taxes. Our income taxes would, on the other hand, be the lowest in the world by a dramatic margin. That is, our income taxes would be down to about 4% of GDP. We would then be in a position where we're taking advantage of our status as a low-tax nation, having a low income tax. We also would be putting into place a system which would allow us, if we need revenues going forward, to get the revenues we need without relying, as we do now, solely on an income tax and then increasing corporate taxes or increasing individual income taxes and thereby, in my view, shooting ourselves economically. You can pick which appendage we would be shooting ourselves in. It would also reduce dramatically the number of returns that the IRS would see. This is why the book is called 100 Million Unnecessary Returns. This eliminates 100 million returns that the IRS now sees. It would, with the VAT returns, return us about the level of tax returns that we have in 1946. And it has a number of other advantages. So obviously eliminating the 100 million returns reduces compliance and administrative costs. It also, I say, would counteract cynicism generated now by income tax complexity. It would encourage savings and investment in the U.S. Everybody's rate on savings would go down, and the tax on investment would go down. The corporate tax would be among the lowest in the world. This would eliminate, this is a technical point, but boy is it important, and it's floating around in legislation now in Congress, would eliminate most of the vexing issues of international tax policy that are going to be very troubling otherwise as we go forward. The plan avoids the difficult issues of transition that have haunted other proposals. The IRS could do its workload, and then this third point I want to slow down on for 1 minute, and that is that with few Americans filing tax returns, there'll be less temptation for political tinkering with the tax system. Now, I don't mean by saying that to suggest that Congress will not tinker with a value-added tax. It's obviously going to tinker with a value-added tax, and it's going to tinker with other aspects of the tax system. The point that I do want to make, and it really, I think, relates very dramatically to the new social contract that the New America Foundation is involved with, is that we have relied, unlike virtually every other country in the world, we have relied on income tax deductions and credits as the solution to whatever economic and social policy ails the country. We use income tax deductions and credits the way my mother used chicken soup. You feel bad, let's have one. And the problem is they haven't worked. I'll cite 2 examples, but I could do this for hours. The 2 I'll pick are the health care, because this is the biggest and most obvious. That is, we relied, it's a historical accident, but we've relied on income tax and payroll tax exclusions for employer-provided health insurance as our way of ensuring the non-poor and the non-elderly part of our population. What is the result? I would argue this is the Titanic of American domestic policy. We have more uninsured people. We have no better health outcomes on any measure of the World Health Organization measures of health outcomes than anybody else, and we have the highest and fastest growing healthcare costs in the world. Example 2, higher education. So this is one I try and teach to my Yale law students in 2 hours, so I'll take 2 minutes here to do it, but you can't be taught. I will tell you, they're smart folks, and I try my damnedest, but it cannot be taught. It just can't be taught. There's 7 provisions that would stimulate either saving for or paying for higher education in the United States. There are 2 tax credits. These provisions all operate in different ways. One applies to room and board and athletic facilities, and another one does not. My favorite is that one of the credits you're disallowed if you've been convicted of a drug crime, but you're eligible for one of the others. You know, and they overlap, and if you use one, you know, you use your Coverdale savings account, you're not eligible for one of the credits and so forth, and you cannot possibly know how they work, and therefore they cannot possibly be effective in allowing the American public to improve its situation in terms of financing higher education, and higher education costs have been rising only second to health care costs in the United States. So it's a huge problem, and we think we can solve these problems through the tax system if we get an income tax which applies only to a relatively thin slice of the top highest earning Americans, which would take us back to the income tax we had before the Second World War. Before the Second World War, we relied on that kind of income tax along with consumption taxes, but they were bad consumption taxes in the form of tariffs to finance the government. We had the Second World War, and the income tax was extended to the masses. And what I'm really doing here is urging that we go back to a pre-war tax system where we have an income tax that only applies to the highest income earners, and we rely on consumption taxes, but we now have one that works to finance the rest of our government. And if we do that, that will take the political incentives away for saying that you're going to give this tax credit for this or that, or you're going to solve this problem through tax deductions and the like, in a way, because these are not special interest provisions. That is, there's a myth that the big provisions in the United States are to do with special interest. They don't. These are general interest provisions. These are the home mortgage interest deduction and the health care exclusion and education credits and all of this stuff. And Congress will be less tempted to use the income tax for this purpose if it only has an income tax that applies to high-income individuals. And this, I think, is a major, major importance, because the one thing we know is that with, you know, a couple of exceptions, these have simply not worked well. I'm happy to talk about the exceptions, but they're just not many. And then finally, by combining taxes commonly used throughout the world, the system facilitates international coordination and fits well with existing international tax and trade agreements. And this is extremely important. This is much more important today than it was years ago. And I think the other paths, that is inventing a new consumption tax or trying to reprise the 1986 tax reform, which we know came unraveled in the 2 decades since, are really not promising avenues for us to take. So with that, I'll stop and let the commentators have at it.
Great, thank you, Michael. It is always a pleasure when Michael Gratz is here with us. I think he's one of the most thorough and comprehensive thinkers who is usually years and occasionally decades ahead of his time on the important issues. And I have no doubt that we'll be hearing more important comprehensive ideas from you in the future, Michael. I have long been a fan of the Gratz tax plan. I think it accomplishes most, if not all, of the most pressing kind of tax reform goals. It would be economically beneficial in that it would shift so much of the tax base away from income towards consumption at a time which it's critically important to do so. It would be simpler. It's distributionally flexible, meaning it has a great structure to it, and then you can make changes to the rates in different places and to the rebates and the smart or the dumb card, I guess you'll call it, in order to change it so that it has the structure that you're looking for. I think 2 of the most important values of it is that it kind of jump starts the changes that we need to make towards tax expenditure reform. It is so difficult to look at the tax base, which is highly problematic right now because, as Michael pointed out, many of these tax breaks, credits, deductions, exemptions affect the middle class in a way that they have huge, strong built-in constituencies, and kind of fundamental reform is one of the only ways that I think we're really going to be able to clean up the base. The other kind of thing that people are talking about now is kind of an optional two-tiered tax system where you can choose a new tax system which gets rid of all of these. I think that's kind of a clever gimmick, but probably not the best way to approach this. But I think this kind of fundamental shift to move away the slice that is now kind of Swiss cheese would be very useful. And then finally, of course, the advantages that it works so well with existing international laws, to get a bunch of tax economists to agree on one tax plan, and then to get a lot of international lawyers to agree on how to make that plan work seems nearly impossible. So there's so many advantages. I've always had one quibble, and it's really quite minor, that I'm not a huge fan of actually removing people from the tax rolls. I am in that nobody wants to sort of go through the work that exists of paying taxes. I'm not even sure I've paid last year's taxes. My extension may still be there because it's so complicated, and I run the New America Tax Program, so that doesn't speak well for either simplicity or my ability to navigate the tax code. But I do think that transparency is critical, and I think that it's useful for, if any of us at the end of the year actually know how much we paid in taxes, I think that's a valuable thing. Now, generally, people who say they want to sort of make everybody aware of what taxes they're paying, it's kind of an anti-tax strategy, and that's not so in what I'm saying. I actually believe that taxes should go up, need to go up, and will go up. But at the same time, I would like to find ways to link people's understanding of how much they're paying in taxes to how much they're getting in government services. And I think there are ways to do that with a value-added tax, but I just want to make sure that that understanding stays strong. In many ways, the tax plan that we've developed here at the New America Foundation is quite similar to Michael's. I'm not going to say much about it, but I just want to touch on the main points. We also believe that shifting towards a consumption base is absolutely necessary in a time when saving is as low as it is in the country. And we've talked about using a progressive consumption tax, the non-Domenici tax, to replace not just the income tax, but also the payroll tax. And this would be a broad sweeping reform, replacing much of the tax code that we currently have. We've also talked about having an income tax, kind of a surtax on that, so that very high income earners who aren't consuming a lot would still pay some in taxes. You can use that as another lever for your distributional goals. Tax expenditure reform is one of the things we emphasize here, just like in Michael's plan. There are, depending on how you calculate it, because you can't actually add these, but there's close to $1 trillion of tax expenditures in the tax code right now. These are policies that are so desirable to create, because who wouldn't rather talk about creating a tax cut instead of a spending program? But they have so many shortcomings in terms of that they don't get the kind of oversight when they're created or once they're up and running that they should. They're generally regressive. They're highly inefficient. They generally pay people to do what they might be doing anyhow, and they pay the wrong people whose behavior have changed. And just finding ways to shift this around is one of the biggest challenges, I think, in tax policy right now. Finally, one additional component that we have at the New America Tax Plan is a large energy tax, which we would use to pay for a lot of government spending and to scale back some of the other taxes that we think are less desirable. Certainly looking to replace taxes that would hurt the economy with something that is as beneficial as an energy tax, which both helps with energy, environment, and raising new revenues. So, with a plan that is not that dissimilar, and again, as an avowed fan of Michael's tax plan, I want to talk just a little bit about why I think we're going to see fundamental tax reform and why I think big tax reform is what hopefully is in the future. First, I think we need grand-scale redesign of the tax code, and that's the kind of discussion we're about to have, because so many things are coming together. As everyone, I'm sure, is aware, we have all these different issues that are really going to come to play at the same time. We have the alternative minimum tax, which you can only limp along and patch on an annual basis for so long. The cost of patching this alternative minimum tax is becoming so expensive, we can't keep sweeping it under the carpet. I say that every year, and we continue to do so. But some year, the answer will be we actually can't keep ignoring the cost of patching it without a more fundamental reform. Certainly the expiration of the tax cuts, which comes at the end of 2010, is going to push the issue of tax reform central onto the agenda. But you also have the issue of entitlement costs. Michael's slides went over that a lot. Suffice it to say, the costs are big. We don't have nearly enough revenue to cover them. And no matter how much somebody wants to scale back government spending, which will have to be part of the solution, we're not going to do it all on the spending side. So taxes are going to have to go up in order to cover the costs, and you want them to go up in the smartest way possible. And then fourthly, there's a whole lot of new unfunded needs in our country. That's a lot of what Frank was talking about, this when he introduced this panel, the Next Social Contract is an initiative that we have here that is trying to focus new programs, new ways to kind of address the different challenges and opportunities of this economy, and a new tax system is going to be necessary in meeting those goals. I think there are a lot of trends that have changed since this current tax system that we have was created that you need to recognize when you're thinking about your tax code. First are low levels of saving. Critically important that we find ways to increase saving in this country. Reducing deficits is one of them. Increasing individual saving is another one of them. So shifting to a consumption tax reflects both the need to increase saving and as well as the need for recognizing the changing demographics, the aging of the population, and that there may be people who aren't getting as much income but are purchasing a lot who would pay part of a consumption tax, and that would be beneficial. And the need for economic growth. And if it's done properly, a consumption tax is going to help grow the economy more than an income tax would. Second, as I mentioned before, just the tremendous growth of tax expenditures shows that we need to jumpstart the process of reforming tax expenditures, and shifting the base of the tax code is a real opportunity to do so. Thirdly, globalization. The fact that we have different ways of working with our trading partners around the globe. We have capital that moves freely. You have to recognize that when you're thinking about taxes. And so, for instance, calls that corporations aren't paying enough of the tax share at only 9 or 10% of GDP or of the budget right now just no longer makes sense. You have to deal with the realities that capital flows to wherever it is going to be most appreciated, and that corporate inversions are a reality of high corporate tax rates. And so I think fundamental reform of the corporate income tax will be part of changes, and it should be. Income inequality. Growing income inequality is something that has now appeared to be recognized by everybody and presents a real problem to our economy. I think looking at the tax code to make it more progressive and to be part of important redistribution tools is one of the big solutions. Now, people can disagree on how progressive the tax code should be. You want to get the right structure in place, and then my personal preference is make it a lot more progressive than it currently is to help combat some of the growth of income inequality. Changing in employment would be another trend that I think we need to recognize. We both have people that don't stay in the same job for as long as they used to, and we have two earner households more and more regularly. This means we need to rethink how we deliver benefits. We need to rethink how we do kind of progressivity. Is it a family base? Is it individual base? We need to take these kinds of changes into consideration when we're thinking about what shifts make sense for a modern economy. There are new crises, which I think point out some of the things that the tax code could be used to either improve or at least not make worse. Those I would include kind of the energy crisis that's going on right now, subprime lending, and the crisis in growth and healthcare costs. And you look at all of those and you can see fundamental shifts in the tax code as ways to help them. An energy tax, certainly keeping taxes where they are on gas, keeping the price of gasoline with a tax up higher where it is, could help change behavior. Not an immensely popular idea, but one that's actually growing in its popularity, and I think is very sensible to think about how to change behavior from that. With the subprime crisis, a lot of questions are starting to come up. Paul Krugman had a column, I guess it was yesterday, saying, you know, we really need to rethink not just how we do housing policy in this country, which is almost all through the tax code, the home mortgage interest deduction, which subsidizes people buying bigger and bigger homes, not necessarily helping with home ownership, but even a larger rethinking, which is when is home ownership the policy goal that we want to be pursuing, and why is it always better than other policy goals? It probably is not. So looking at that, thinking about the employer, the deduction, the exemption for employer-provider health care is certainly one that I think will be at the centerpiece of any fundamental reform, because it helps with both health care and tax improvements. And then just finally, to end on this note, that I think this will happen and this should happen both because this country has made trillions of dollars of promises in spending that we cannot keep. And in order to meet at least some of the realities of an aging population that has been promised things from entitlement programs that will be very difficult to meet, revenues will have to be part of that solution. The higher your revenues are, the more important that you have an efficient tax base with which to underwrite them. And then secondly, there are just too many investments that this country is shortchanging right now. changes that reflect globalization, changes that invest things that would take money right now and have higher returns to the economy over the long term, whether it's healthcare reform, increasing spending in education, basic research. These things have been shortchanged, and you don't want to be short-sighted, which is sort of the definition of how we do budgeting in this country, but you want to improve the emphasis that we put on the long term. And I think fundamental tax reform, in order to help meet some of the goals and investments that should be met, will be one of the most important parts of the picture. Thank you.
Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. once observed, "The United States is governed not by logic, but by Congress." And in that spirit, I want to suggest that the criteria by which we judge the merits of competing tax systems and tax plans should not be strictly economic. They have to be political as well. They have to take into account political reality, the behavior of voters and their elected representatives. And there are two criteria in particular that I look for in comparing various proposals for radical tax reform. One is, does it contribute to U.S. international competitiveness? A subject that Michael Gratz dwelt upon, unusually for a proponent of tax reform in the U.S., because most of them treat this as though the U.S. were on its own little planet instead of its own hemisphere. So there's the international context of tax reform. The second criterion that I think is important is political sustainability. Can this system work without inspiring cycles of tax revolt of the kind that have shaken the American system ever since the 1970s? By my two tests, Professor Gratz's plan passes with flying colors. I'll end the suspense right now. And others might fit those criteria as well. I'll just spend a few minutes looking at each of these tests for the value of a tax system. First, international competition. This was not really a factor on the minds of the conservatives and libertarians who came up with what has been the most influential program in tax reform for the last 30 or 40 years. Essentially cutting taxes on wealthy individuals, cutting the income tax. At the time that program was formulated, in the 1960s and 1970s, before it began to be enacted in the Reagan administration and then subsequently by the second Bush administration, that was a reasonable assumption. They assumed that you had a largely autarkic U.S. Industrial economy. The problem was the shrinking profit margins in this period of wage price inflation. If you reduce taxes on the rich, they would then reinvest that money in the United States, thereby stimulating productivity growth. Again, that was probably a reasonable assumption in the 1970s, and arguably the Reagan tax cuts may have had some of the effect that were desired. But today, as Professor Gratz has pointed out, we live in a radically transformed world in which the scale of international capital flows dwarfs the migration of labor across borders and also international trade across borders. So I think of the world we're in now, in the early 21st century, it's similar to a federation like the United States, where the sovereign countries are sort of like states in a federal union, where you have a common market, at least a common integrated financial market. In the states, Texas, Mississippi, California, Minnesota, are following various boosterish schemes, competing for investment within their borders. And it can take the form of a race to the bottom in some cases, low labor costs, but it can also take the form of more investment in public infrastructure, in offsets, in various tax deals with corporations that locate plant within the state or the province. This is essentially the model that most other industrial countries are following now. It's no longer the old model where you have infant industry protection, nor is it the sort of East Asian model of export promotion in finished goods, but rather you're competing in a system of international capital and of internationalized production. You don't even care if the entire automobile, for example, is made within your country. You want the high value added portions made within your country, and the low value added production can take place elsewhere. So it's a competition to lure, not seize, but to lure, to attract foreign direct investment and in high value-added production within your borders. And that calls for an entirely different approach. And one of the things that can help that would be lowering or abolishing corporate income taxes. In 2001, Ted Halstead and I, in our book, The Radical Center, proposed lowering the U.S. corporate income tax rate to 0. Realistically, Professor Gratz's reduction of it to 15 or 20% would certainly be a step in the right direction. And I think it would make us one of the most competitive countries in the world in that dimension of attracting foreign investment by itself. So much for the international context. What about sustainability? You know, I get irritated, frankly, by people who talk about the deficits in the U.S. as though this is a moral failure on the part of Americans. We're not living within our means, you know, yada, yada, yada. In my opinion, the reason we've had these tax revolts, beginning with Howard Jarvis, the property tax revolt in California, then what I think of as the Reagan tax revolt, and the Bush tax revolt, which we're suffering from now, has to do with the nature of our tax system. It's not that Americans are any less prudent or responsible than Germans or French or Japanese. If the Germans and the French and the Japanese had our tax system, you would have seen these Reagan and Bush type tax revolts which create these deficits. And I say they create the deficits because the public likes the level of spending. They like the goods and services. We've seen that. Conservatives and libertarians have failed to slash spending, but they have succeeded repeatedly as a result of these tax revolts in slashing the revenues. So you get these big, you know, bubble-like deficits blown every time there's this. You have a conservative administration and conservative triumphs in Congress. Well, so we've had these cycles of tax revolt in the United States, but it's only against certain kinds of taxes. All right? There hasn't been a generic tax revolt in the United States in the last quarter century. There's been a revolt against transparent, visible taxes. There's been a revolt against property taxes in California and other states, and there's been a revolt against income taxes at the federal level under Reagan and under the second Bush. There has been no revolt against state and local sales taxes, even though those have gone up and they're very regressive and people are spending more money on them now than they used to in many states. There's been no revolt against the payroll tax, which was raised dramatically in the course of the 1980s. And as we saw, it's the highest tax that people pay now. Well, why is that? It's because they're invisible, or to use the language of economists, they're not transparent. There's no sticker shock. People in the United States in the last 30, 40 years have rebelled against taxes that have to be paid on April 15th, where you send a letter to the IRS and there's a big number there and you're shocked by the size of the number. You can pay an enormous amount of taxes that is taken out of your check by the payroll tax every 2 weeks, or disappears every time you buy groceries, and that doesn't create that kind of sticker shock. You know, here I differ with my colleague Maya McGinnis. I think transparency is a virtue from the ideal economic point of view. From a political point of view, I think it's a vice. I think that if we relied more on taxes that were not transparent, we would not have this problem of recurring tax revolts. And I think that their absence from other advanced industrial countries is a result of the fact that they rely to a far lesser degree in terms of their national finance on income taxes. And the property taxes, the consumption tax they have, the value-added tax, does not create sticker shock because it's embodied in the final price of the good that the consumer buys. There's not the sticker shock that you would have if you were writing a property tax check, you know, once a year to whatever authority there is. So once again, I think Professor Gratz's plan has very many merits. This is one that I want to add. He doesn't dwell on this heavily in his book. But I think the very fact that he proposes reducing the income tax and adding a new consumption tax, the value-added tax, and keeping the payroll tax, I think this means that there would be far less reliance on taxes in the United States at the federal level that produce sticker shock, and ergo, I think these kinds of Reagan and Bush tax revolts would be much more less likely in the future. Let me say one thing about the consumption tax. In 2001 in the Radical Center, Ted Halstead and I proposed a progressive consumption tax, the non-Domenici Caldor tax that Professor Gratz mentioned. He said most of its supporters have abandoned it by now. I abandoned it several years ago. I came to the conclusion, for various reasons, that it's unworkable, mainly because of the sticker shock aspect, because you would have to fill out a form every April 15th, subtract your savings from your income, and then you would have to write a number with a fairly big number to the IRS. And while this is appealing in theory, given the devastation of our budget by sticker shock-induced tax revolts, the last thing I think we should want to do at this point in history is to create more heart attacks on April 15th. And if you can achieve the same goal of moving to a consumption-based system through the means that everyone else has used in the rest of the world for several decades, the value-added tax, more power to it. I just want to conclude by being a bit provocative and defending tax expenditures, which economists hate. But again, the United States is governed by Congress, not by logic. And I agree entirely with the theoretical critique of tax expenditures by economists. But in this country, for particular reasons, I think that tax expenditures can achieve some objectives, particularly where redistribution between groups and regions is involved, that direct appropriations cannot accomplish. We're moving slowly and painfully towards a post-racist society, but this was an apartheid country, when I was young, and we've got some ways to go. And in any society, no matter how enlightened, the haves tend to resist programs that disproportionately benefit people unlike them. And that can include territory, northern Italy versus southern Italy. It doesn't have to be ethnicity or race. I think if you look at the success of the Earned Income Tax Credit, a wage subsidy in the form of a tax expenditure, it has not created a populist backlash, even though most of the beneficiaries are the poor, and particularly the non-white poor, in the way that direct congressional appropriations that disproportionately went to poor African Americans and to poor Latinos, in my view, probably would create. The other thing I'd like to say is Congress has to have something to do, right? And one of the things they like doing when they run for office periodically is to say, I raised the X tax credit, by 2% or something. And of course, it was very small to begin with, but this sounds impressive if you're running for office. And I think, that's just going to be a feature of any system. I've proposed something called a total tax credit system where people who pay only Social Security taxes could claim the same sort of child care credits, child tax credit, various other home mortgage interest deduction that people who pay income taxes, in addition to Social Security taxes, could pay. But I'm pleased to say that Professor Gratz's proposal of offsets to people who pay value-added tax, and in the regressivity of the value-added tax, as I understand his proposal, would be compensated for somewhat by offsets in the payroll tax. And the way that would work is when you go to work for your employer, you would just have a list of characteristics, married, with child. You would get slightly more in your paycheck. Slightly less would be withheld than, say, the single person like me, without a child. And that's a perfectly rational way to do tax expenditure policy, and it can be done through the payroll tax system, and it needn't be done through the income tax system. But having said that, I do think that any system you have is going to turn into Swiss cheese one way or another. And I'm not entirely, and in some cases, given the difficulty of overt redistribution within the U.S., I guess I'm much softer on some degree of reliance on tax expenditures as a tool of public policy. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's been very interesting so far. We're going to chat among ourselves for just a couple of minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from you all, so you'll have plenty of opportunity to get in your 2 cents as well. I'd like to ask you, when you do ask questions, to please identify yourself, and we all appreciate it if you can make your questions questions and not speeches. First of all, Michael, do you want to respond to any of the comments that have been made about your proposal?
No, let's give others a chance.
Okay.
I'll have a chance.
Michael Lynn was talking about tax expenditures and the good things about them. I can't resist to mention my latest favorite tax credit. This is in the extender bill in the House Ways and Means Committee, which would provide a new tax credit for the production of jet fuel from chicken litter. So I think we're a
There's
bit...
a four-letter word for...
There is, but this is a family audience, so... I think, though, that we're some distance away from the kind of grand social policies that you were talking about in the context of tax expenditures. I would actually like to ask Mike Gratz and Maya, though, about this question of, given the political constituencies for all of these things, are we really going to drop them all in favor of a clean value-added tax?
Well, I'll go first. I don't think the value-added tax is going to be necessarily clean. I mean, you try and start with the broadest base, but there will be incentives for spending on this or that Congress will likely come up with, and maybe also higher taxes on spending for things that Congress doesn't like as well. I don't have any doubt, at least over time, that we'll end up in that position. Other countries have certainly done so. But I do think it's important. I think that Michael really puts an issue to Maya and me that's really at the forefront of this question. It's as a policy question. Politics are something quite different. And that is, is it appropriate to be relying on these tax expenditures? He cites the Earned Income Tax Credit, which I think, along with the charitable deduction, are the two. If I were arguing, those are the two I would pick as the most successful. Even though the IRS, you may remember, got into a lot of trouble when it started shifting audit resources to auditing the Earned Income Tax Credit, away from auditing high-income individuals, and it had a lot of fraud in the EITC as well, because you could actually make money by over-reporting your income in certain income groups. And the IRS wasn't used to doing that. But I look at the House bill the Senate bill for a house, $8,000 credit for new homeowners, or McCain's proposal for a $5,000 credit for health insurance, or any of these new proposals. The one that drives me the craziest is the one that you're most conversant with these days, which is everybody's solution to the long-term care problem is a $3,000 credit for long-term care, as if that's going to solve the long-term care problem. And as long as you can propose $3,000 credit for long-term care and say, well, we've done this to solve that problem, you can avoid dealing with the problem. You can claim you've done something. And our experience with this is just very discouraging in terms of who benefits and how these things get structured and so forth, notwithstanding the benefits, I think, of the charitable deduction and the Earned Income Tax Credit. So I would like to see these things show up somewhere else, and I do think you get them out of the income tax. And I think, for example, the $1 million two-home rule for home mortgages would be much more difficult to sustain if the home mortgage interest deduction were limited to high-income people and so forth. So I think it would change the politics, but I think the only way you change the politics of this is to change the tax base. That's where I think Maya was saying, and I think we agree entirely with that. You're not going to repeal these things one or two at a time. You have to repeal the tax. You can't repeal the tax expenditure. And the great advantage of tax expenditures, I guess, over other expenditures, direct expenditures, is that you can either repeal the expenditure or you can repeal the tax, and they go away. And here I'm actually doing it by repealing the tax for the vast majority of Americans.
What?
Yeah, I agree pretty much with everything that Michael said. I think either way, there will be changes made to tax expenditures, and the reason is because that's where the money is, and this country needs money. And when we start looking for offsets, whenever we decide it's actually time to start paying for things, and we start trying to figure out how to do it, things like capping the home mortgage interest deduction or eliminating it for second homes is going to be a lot more appealing than some of the other options. When we start thinking about really reforming the AMT, this whole trade of getting rid of the state and local tax deduction in order to fix the AMT makes a whole lot of sense. When we start talking about how to pay for increasing health insurance, capping or eliminating the exemption of employer-provided health care makes a whole lot of sense. So I do think that we will start to get at some of these, and probably the big ones at some point, again, because that's where the money is. I don't think there's any way to make dramatic progress without really changing the base. And that's why something like this is so appealing. And all of us are aware of all the pitfalls of getting from where we are today and all the constituency groups and all the lobbying groups to something that looks tremendously different. And the good news in the bad news may be that there's so much bad news out there that we have to pull all this stuff together and have some kind of major negotiation on the fiscal policies of these country, and that some better tax code comes out of that. I think that's possible. Just on the topic of tax expenditures, I actually think that the EITC, which sort of most people hold up as immensely popular, has nothing to do with that it's not transparent. I think it has to do with that it's linked to incentives that people like. So they feel that the earned income tax credit is linked to work, and therefore it's a very it's a good policy that helps the people you want to help for doing the right thing. So it meets a lot of needs in that way, and I think there's a lot of support for expanding it, and I also think that there'd be a lot of support for the smart card, even though it would not be something that's a middle class entitlement. It would be targeted towards helping the poor, and I think it would actually be very popular. I guess I have more of a sense that people are willing to support programs that are for the poor. What I'd like to see is a scaling back of the tax expenditures. If I couldn't get rid of all of them, I'd get rid of all of the ones that go to the wealthy and the middle class and keep the low income ones there, and I believe there is popularity for that. But the bottom line is, your point, of course, is right, and Michael's kind of dose of political reality, of course, is right, that you can't sweep all this stuff out, and it's kind of like pushing a boulder up the hill. You're going to push it up, hopefully a lot at one point, and it's going to roll back down. Whatever tax code we have next, we're going to Swiss cheese that one up too, and then we'll do fundamental reform again. We'll never have the perfect tax code, and we'll never keep the perfect tax code.
Mike, before we go too far afield, I wonder for people who have not yet read the book, of course everyone will buy the book, but for everybody who hasn't yet read it, could you describe in a little more detail how the smart card, how the debit card actually works?
Well, it works, almost however you want it to work is the advantage. I mean, what I was looking for was a mechanism which replaces the filing of an annual tax return as the basis for providing relief. And you can do it based on people's wages, either through this payroll tax offset or use the wages as a way of getting them the debit card. The key is that it provides value-added tax relief in the sense that you swipe it at the grocery store, you swipe it when you buy whatever it is you buy, the same way you now swipe a credit card or a debit card or these store discount cards.
To avoid these timing challenges.
And it avoids the timing challenges. That is, it delivers it immediately,
right,
either in the form of a wage, increased after-tax wages, or in the form of when you're purchasing the goods. And it enables you to do essentially whatever you want in terms of providing for offsets. Of course, the point here is that the more information you require in order to use the smart card, the more you're returning back to something that looks an awful lot like a tax return. And so I've got an appendix in the book. I've described this in some detail where I say, let people file once a year what their income is. You can use information that's already being collected. If you've got dividends, interest, and wages above a certain amount, you don't get it, and get one of these, and so forth. That you can do it in a very gross way. The problem with things like the earned income tax credit, which is also you can't teach in 2 hours in the Yale Law School class, so I dare anybody to do it anywhere else, is that we've tried to be so precise because Congress responds to the anecdote, right? And so the anecdote is the person collecting municipal bond interest who's also working a low-wage job and is eligible for the EITC, well, we've got to stop that because they're municipal bond interest. You know, the example that I've always thrown up is, because I do it based on individual wages instead of married couples' wages, is the low-income spouse, usually a woman is the example, who's working at a child care center or working at some low-wage job, who's married to the investment banker who gets the smart card. You know, and I say, so be it. You know, that's just the price for simplification. But you know, if you have to know somebody else's income, and so you know, then it gets to be complicated. I suppose if you know, if the family files an income tax return, you're not eligible. So if you filed an income tax return, the idea is to keep the information to a minimum and yet deliver the benefits. And you can do it. The advantage of this technology, which is now available, which wasn't available previously, is that you can do pretty much whatever you want to do based on whatever policies you want, which I suppose is both a plus and a minus of the technology.
This question of transparency, Maya and Michael have provided two very interesting perspectives on this. Tell me where you come down.
I'll tell you where I come down. So here's a question. How many people in the room know what their total income tax was for last year? 4. How many people know what the size of your refund was, or whether you got a refund or you didn't? You see, this is the problem. How many people know what Social Security? Everybody knows. You know, everybody knows. So you know, so the transparency is, what do we now know about the income tax? This is why I disagree with you a little bit about your political story on the anti-tax movement. I think it's true of the wealthy. It's not true of the vast majority of Americans. They don't know how much income taxes they paid. All they know is, did they get a refund and how much it was. Oh, you know, I go walk around the building on April 15th. I say, how much taxes did you pay last year? And somebody says, oh, I got a $1,000 refund. Yeah. Well, no, that's not exactly the right answer. So, you know, the question is, what do you mean by transparency? Now, the VAT, I mean, so I don't believe the income tax is all that transparent, even though you get the W-2. W-2 also tells you how much payroll taxes you paid for last year. The sum is there. You know, nobody knows how much payroll taxes they paid for last year. You couldn't tell us that. So I don't believe that the return, I don't believe any of that stuff. Let me just be clear. I just don't believe any of it. The question for me, which I do talk about in the book a little bit, is whether the value-added tax ought to be transparent. That is, whether you ought to know when you buy goods or services how much of the price is the tax. And this varies, the practice varies. In the UK, for example, it tells you on the receipt how much your value-added tax is. In Italy, you don't know at all, it's just the price. And so even within Europe, there are differences. I'm very much in favor of saying how much the tax was when you have the receipt, the same way that you know exactly what the sales tax is each time you pay it. You know, I think that the idea, I said in the early edition of my case book, my course book for my tax class, that that filing returns is the way the American people participate in democracy. Right. Well, you know, that may have been true in the old days when my father sat around the dining room table and filled out his own tax return. But now it's just a commercial exercise. People, you know, either using a computer answering questions with TurboTax, or their alternatives, or their, you know, 60% of people are using paid preparers. And so it's just another commercial transaction. So as a political matter, I think things have changed dramatically on this transparency. It's interesting because it's an issue that everybody has strong feelings about, and I've never seen anybody write anything about it that sort of takes it apart and says, you know, what's good and what's bad about it, what do we mean by it. But it's an issue that's heartfelt with people. I'm very much of the view the value-added tax ought to be stated, but I don't buy much the annual return as an answer to this question.
There are lots of people in the policy world who are great fans of the value-added tax, but not quite your value-added tax. My colleague at the Tax Policy Center, Lynn Berman, has talked about this. Ezekiel Emanuel and Victor Fuchs are talking about it. And it's the idea of an add-on value-added tax, maintain basically the income, a reformed income tax system, but add on a value-added tax to pay for health care reform. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's very important to know that one of my goals, the plan itself is both revenue neutral and distributionally neutral. But Maya, I thought, put it nicely. I never heard it put this way, that it's distributionally flexible in the sense that you can do things at the bottom and the top as you wish. It's also revenue flexible in the sense that you can add another point or two to the value-added tax and pick up a lot of money, and you can add some rates at the very top on the income side and pick up a lot of money if that's what you want to do. I'm a person who really puts a lot of stock in the idea of getting people out of the income tax in the sense that I don't think a member of Congress is going to go on the floor of Congress and say, let's lower that $100,000 exemption or whatever it is after it's indexed and bring more people into the income tax. I don't think that's going to happen. So I think that the structure protects us against that. But it's very flexible. I am very skeptical of us taking a 5% value-added tax or whatever the number is and paying for extending health insurance in some way without taking people out of the income tax. Because then I think there is a real danger that we're marching toward the model of the rest of the OECD, which is to be a high tax, have high income taxes and high value-added taxes, and have spending go up in an unlimited way. And this is where the fiscal conservative in me says, I don't really like this idea of just taking a value-added tax, putting it on top of everything else, and not using it to buy down our income tax.
Michael, you also have talked about the idea of a value-added tax as an add-on to your total tax credit. What do you think of that idea?
Well, I think the United States can expand its government share of GDP by a few percentage points, and we would still be way below the 40% average in the OECD. And I think, like everyone at this table, I don't want us to be Sweden, or Denmark. We could be. It wouldn't be the end of the world, if 40% of GDP went to government, particularly because most of those transfer programs are purchasing goods and services in the private economy. So it's not that they're vanishing from the economy, but still, I would be uncomfortable. And for political reasons, again, I think about everything politically. I think that it's a chicken or an egg question. In order for people to be shifted from the income tax, or the tax burden to be shifted from income tax to a consumption tax, I think there has to be a pre-existing consumption tax that's already part of the federal mix. I assume it will be small at first, on the camel's nose under the tent theory, before you get the whole camel. You get the nose and then the head and then the shoulders and so on. And I'd just like to ask Michael what he thinks about that, whether he could live with a small VAT of the one proposed by the Center for American Progress, for example, to pay for some health care, which could then be inflated later while you deflate the income tax.
Well, I guess my answer would be that if we had a small VAT for health, I believe we need health care reform. It's not the moment to talk about that in great detail. And we need to pay for some of it. We're going to need some extra revenues. If that came up first and we ended up with a small value-added tax to fund vouchers or whatever for individual health coverage, that would be one way to begin the process. I would then be one of the voices arguing, now let's use it to buy down the income tax. Let's increase the VAT to buy down the income tax. There'll be other voices arguing, let's use it to fix bridges. Let's use it for the highway trust fund. Let's use it for this or that. If I could have my druthers, I'd rather see this first and that second. But it could turn out the other way, and it could have a happy ending, in my sense, by buying down income taxes. And one thing that you might have, what's really interesting about this politically, economically, and this divergence is the corporate income tax. The one thing that hasn't been said is that the corporate income tax is enormously popular politically. So you don't hear anybody saying much about, lowering corporate taxes on the stump. They talk about, bad, big multinational corporations and so forth. They demonize a corporation. And yet we all know that the corporate income tax is a very bad tax economically. If you didn't have an individual income tax at all, I'd be for zero. It's only that I think you get a shelter at the corporate level if you don't have no corporate tax and you have some individual income tax, that we need a corporate tax at all. It's a very bad tax economically, but it's a very popular tax politically. One of the other possibilities is that you use a value-added tax to pay for some health care and to buy down corporate rates. And then you get the corporate rate down. That will then put pressures on getting the individual income tax rate down because they can't be too far apart. They were 91%, 50%. I'm reminded of Boris Bitker, the first time I met him. He was a Yale law professor for many, many years, most successful treatise writer in the tax field ever. But he was commenting on a paper by Norman Ture. Norman Ture was the Undersecretary of the Treasury, a supply-side economist for the Reagan administration's Undersecretary of the Treasury. And Norman Ture was yelling about the corporate tax burden and the double tax on corporations. This was at a time when the individual rate was 70%, the corporate rate was 48%. And Boris pointed out that his paper said Norman Ture on behalf of Norman Ture Incorporated. And he said that he didn't think Norman had to go to the capital markets in order, that wasn't what drove him to incorporate, and that he could only assume that the corporate tax was an opportunity as well as a burden in order for Norman to have incorporated. And that's the relationship that I think one needs to keep an eye on in this story. But the politics of the corporate side, I think, are going to be very interesting, because a place where the domestic companies and the multinationals could get together is on a low corporate tax rate, whereas, as we've seen in prior legislation in this recent years, they often split on the treatment of domestic versus foreign income.
Well, don't you think it's encouraging, though, that Senator McCain has made corporate income tax reductions part of his campaign, and Senator Obama appears to be under pressure to go along with it to some degree?
I have to say, though, I'm a little discouraged that the longer the campaign goes, the less interesting, the less important, I think, the McCain corporate tax proposals are. He seems to be watering them down by the day. Maya, before we turn it over to the audience for some
Howard,
questions.
you should just take the opportunity to plug your excellent tax blog, by the way, where you've written on that.
Okay. My excellent tax.
Howard has an excellent tax.
It's called TaxVox, TaxVox, and everyone is welcome to come look at it. Before we do move on to the audience, I'd like to ask you about health VATs. What do you think of them?
Not a fan. I think that, I waver on this. The question of dedicated taxes, I think, is a really interesting one. Is it better that we have lots of dedicated taxes to certain programs or not? And I see arguments on both sides. But overall, I think that budgeting is an exercise of evaluating national priorities and what things are worth funding. And I think when you build in dedicated taxes, it makes it harder to change from one priority to another priority. And the world changes. Globalization has meant that a lot of people who were doing well before aren't doing well now, and a lot of people are doing better than they were before. And I feel like you should have, just as one example, but you should have a budget that's flexible enough to meet those changes. Dedicated taxes tend to stand in the way of that. On the other hand, they're kind of elegant in design, and they also help you get a sense of how much you're spending on something, whether it's worth it or not. I think that's very valuable in itself. But I tend to agree with Michael that I would rather switch from one less efficient to one more efficient tax first, change the overall structure of the tax base so that it's kind of as both fair and efficient as possible, and then deal with the rates. And before I start expanding new programs, I'd like to get the current budget in a fiscally sustainable position. So I think you have to sequence, how are we going to deal with the current commitments that we have, we know can't fund, scale them back, and also meet the new funded priorities that we should be meeting that we're currently not, including health care.
Questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
I have to make a comment.
Could you introduce yourself?
Yes, Rochelle Friedman with the Coalition on Human Needs. One quick comment and then a question about your plan. Focusing on the corporate tax statutory rate without simultaneously looking at the plethora of business tax credits, deductions, and the ability, for example, to determine the depreciation rate in a favorable manner, resulting in an effective rate that's much lower than the statutory rate, I think presents an incomplete picture of corporate taxes. And I think that your slides presented that incomplete picture. My question to you is, you said that your system is revenue neutral and distribution neutral. I have a question about what's the revenue baseline, because as has been mentioned, we don't have enough revenue now to take care of our needs. And secondly, the distribution line, I guess I would agree with panelists who have indicated that we have such a progressive tax system. It has become much less progressive, at least in the last 8 years.
Let me just say one thing about your comment, which is you're right about the corporate tax, and I talk about it in a chapter on the corporate tax in the book. I didn't have it in the slide. But one of the main things that I would do to broaden the corporate base is to have corporations report for tax purposes the same income they report for book purposes, which I think the ability to report one thing to the government, another thing to shareholders, has allowed the whole tax shelter business to flourish. But I also talk about depreciation allowances, and you certainly have to think about both. But the statutory rate is much more important than the economists have tended to make it, and so that's why I focused on it here. And it also has to do with the international things like transfer pricing. So I price a product between here and Ireland, and all the money goes to Ireland entirely due to the statutory rate and not the other rate. But I do talk about it in the book. On the distribution, so the revenue baseline I use is the current revenues. I think it's about 19% of GDP is what I use, which is a historic average. It's not the 16% we had in 2001, 2002, 2003. But it's about 18 or 19% of GDP. I think it's 19% is what I used, which is current revenues, and it's historic revenues. On distribution, I want to say something because it's very interesting about the very top. And the very top makes a lot of difference in the current situation of inequality. And I had the opportunity to request the Wall Street Journal to take a look at the 400, what they call the fortunate 400. These were the 400 people who paid the most taxes in the United States. In 2005 was the last year they had data. And they had this data, now the people changed some, but they had this data, they got the IRS to run this data, and the IRS had done it before. They had this data beginning in the early 90s through 2005. In order to be in this group, you had to make $100 million in a year. 2005. So this was income of $100 million, not a lifetime accumulation of wealth. So there are 400 people at least that have $100 million or more of income. Their average, what you see is that their average tax rate in the mid-90s was about 28%. In the late 90s, toward the end of the Clinton administration, it was about 23%. And in 2005, it was 18.4%. And what was driving this? Well, what was driving it is something we haven't talked about at all today, which was capital gains tax rates. In the early part of the 90s, the capital gain tax rate was about 25%. It was then lowered to 20% in the Clinton administration, and this rate, then their income dropped, their taxes dropped, and then it was lowered to 15% at the beginning of the Bush administration, and their income dropped. With a kind of, if you had a 25% tax rate, and I talk about this in the book, but I didn't talk about it in the slide, you could tax capital gains and ordinary income at the same rate. If you had a 25% rate on capital gains and ordinary income, and you would avoid things like whether this carried interest that is now being earned by the private equity guys is capital gain or ordinary income, which is a huge issue before Congress these days. If you tax capital gains at a 25% rate and you require these people to pay consumption taxes at, say, 14% on their yachts and private planes and whatever else it is that they're spending their money on it, their consumption, I think they pay more taxes. I mean, I describe it as distributionally neutral because you don't get good consumption data up at the very top. But I would be prepared to argue that they'll pay more taxes under this system than they will under the current system at the very top. That fortunate 400 would find their taxes going up, their combined taxes going up, not down, and I think going up in an important way. More, by the way, than it's likely to go up if, as Obama says he's going to do, he raises the rate back to the Clinton rate of 39.6 and raises the capital gains rate, which he says now to 20, right? I think that this actually would increase the burden more on the top than what he says he wants to do, which is the current political situation. But we'd have to know more to know that for sure.
Okay, let's have one more question and a quick answer, and then we'll get you all out of here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Michael, hi. Charles Bloom for the, I guess this case, the Coalition for Prosperous America. I think you know, for a long time, I've been a fan of your plan. Before you wrote it down, I was a fan of it. I'm happy to have it in writing. The CPA is struggling with it. I want to make a quick comment and then ask a question about it. We come at it not as a tax issue. For us, it's a trade issue. So I have two things which I heard this morning that I think that set up red flags. One is the broadest possible base for the lowest possible rate on the consumption tax. I'd rather have a narrower base and a higher rate that gives you more bang for the buck at the border, number one. Number two, a multiplicity of taxes with dedicated uses, let's say, creates nightmares at the border, I think, unless someone can convince me differently. I think that is really a step backward from trade facilitation. I know a subject that will be discussed here later in the week, I think. I want to ask specifically about energy taxes, whether it's a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. How well would a VAT coexist with either of those? Could it replace either of those? And how in the world are we going to sort this out if we have these sort of two trains moving ahead? Well, a lot of people are trying to push them to go fast. Can we rationalize this, or are we going to have a mess?
I actually don't talk at all in the book about energy taxes. I decided not to. But I spent a lot of time in 1990 talking about energy taxes with the budget negotiations that were going on then. And one thing that you find is that you can border adjust an energy tax on energy. So if I'm taxing gasoline and I'm exporting gasoline or I'm importing gasoline, I can border adjust it. Or if I'm importing electricity, which we do from Canada, for example, I can border adjust it. But what you cannot do is border adjust embedded energy taxes, so that if I'm in a high energy use business like chemicals or automobile, steel, aluminum, those kinds of things, an energy tax cannot be border adjusted because it's embedded in the price as it goes through production. And what we ended up with when we talked about this, and we came close to getting an energy tax in 1990 in secret meetings, was a manufacturer's exemption. Well, if you exempt manufacturing from the energy tax, you've really reduced the base of the energy tax, not to mention the effect it has on global warming, which is a new context for talking about energy taxes. You know, the value-added tax, I understand your point. You want to tax imports at the highest rate possible. But if you narrow the base to something like clothing, for example, you may just have eliminated your import tax on clothing. So be careful about, you want the base that you want and the rate that you want. And so be careful about that trade-off, would be my argument. This proposal is only border adjusting for one thing, which is the value-added tax. If you had an energy tax, the only other thing you could border adjust for would be energy itself, and the rest of it would not be border adjusted. So you could have an energy tax operating side by side with a value-added tax. Energy taxes, I mean, you know, that's a subject for a whole nother meeting and a whole nother book, I think. But energy taxes raise lots of issues, and they raise particularly lots of regional issues in the U.S. You know, if you tax carbon, you've disadvantaged eastern coal versus western coal. If you tax home heating oil, you've created huge problems in the Northeast, both regionally and distributionally. And many of these same problems, by the way, exist with the cap and trade program that exists with these various energy taxes. And, you know, we dealt with, when we got through it all, I was convinced that an ad valorem energy tax was probably the best. A BTU tax was probably the second best in terms of having the most even impact. But if you really want to tax carbon, you have to have a carbon tax, and you get very different results than just taxing energy for conservation reasons. So this is a very complicated question. But you could certainly have an energy tax. A broad energy tax base is about a quarter of a broad value-added base, as a rule of thumb. I always like these rules of thumb because then I can figure out what it would take. So it would take, you know, an energy tax 4 times as big to raise the revenue that the value-added tax is raising on its rate as a rule of thumb. That's a pretty good it's a useful rule of thumb because it tells you if I'm talking 10% on VAT, you're talking 40% on energy. And that, you're not going to have a 40% energy tax. So that it doesn't have the revenue kick that a relatively low rate value added tax has. But it's an interesting question and one that really deserves some more attention. And that's one I don't talk. I leave that one out. I can't say, oh, that's in the book, you should just read the book. I leave that one out completely. Reading the book will do you no good at all.
It's implied in the book.
It is implied.
Well, Mike, we look forward to your next book on energy taxes. Thank you all, Mike Gratz and Maya McGinnis and Michael Lynn, for this very interesting program. And thank you all to the audience as well.
Yeah, of course.